Good rising, brethren. This is Big Judah, cutting you guys in California. Before I begin, give all praises to the Most High, Yahweh. Acknowledgement to the earthly mother. Who is wisdom? Who is the Holy Spirit? Acknowledgement to Hawashai. I pray that the Most High blesses this lesson, this evening, gives more knowledge and understanding of the events of the past, in order to understand the events that are currently happening on the earth, so we get a much better understanding of things that are soon to come on the earth. Brethren, let's get into this quickly. The Atlantean traditions in ancient Britain. I'm going to go a little bit deeper into this information, okay? So you guys can check this out right here. Chapter 2, the beings behind the stones. Moving from the astronomically and scientifically exact stones to the meso of fairy legends. Surrounding them is at first glance a peculiar juxtaposition. But when examined, it is appropriate in its correct historical context. Throughout Scottish mythology, fairies and giants are closely associated with the building of megalithic circles and alignments. So it's like giants and fairies. Remember now, we were talking about who were the fairies. They were like these people that were bigger, more than just men, and also had magical powers. But see, like what they've done in the pretty much in society, they act like giants were never here, and then those mighty men are now fairies, little white girls with wings. Okay, but they are closely associated with the building of megalithic circles and alignments. These, okay, as in England, Ireland, and Wales, are credited with a highly supernatural function. The generation of magical energy conjoined to the movements of observed heavenly bodies. So you got the magic, you got the skies, and they're all working in tune together. This spiritual science of divination through astronomy is the science of Atlantis, okay, carried on by survivors in all the colonies. So it's all like it's originated from a certain source of Atlantis, and it's just carries on in different areas. It says where the old knowledge was adapted and reinterpreted by guardians of the sacred flame. In the legends and tales of elves and fairies, the civilizations of the preceding races in Scotland are forever perpetuated as a traditional folk memory. It is a folk memory that never fails to credit these beings with vast powers over nature and the ability to control all variety of psychic and astronomical phenomena. Let's see, when you look at Moses and all of the things that he was doing, it looked like he had control, right, of the forces of nature through the power of the Most High. Elijah, same thing. Many of the prophets, same things, performing these astronomical feats. It says one of the most famous races of Scots fairy lore is that known as the Pecks or Pecks. They are variously described as small beings with long red hair, long arms, and large feet. They sound very much like the Atlanto-Irish furbolgs, remembered today as the dwarves. So just like watching, like I used to love, I still love watching, a lot of movies like that with the dwarves and things like that, Lord of the Rings. But now, like I said, we know that these beings have different meanings. Okay? It says many of the stone monuments are associated with the Pecks, who are said to have built them by utilizing their magical powers and calling down the sun from heaven. Just like Elijah, when he was battling with the priests of Baal, right? Using powers from heaven, okay? Hence of the sky gods, right? The later word pict, which signifies a dwarvish, painted or aboriginal Scots race, is obviously derived from Peck, and the Picts were feared by their supplanters, the Celts. So the supplanters, the other nations coming in, but they feared the dwarves, okay? They feared the people that were there before they got there. So we understand that it's actually a supplanter race that's coming in and taking over the original lands from the original people. And we know eventually they're going to come in and actually take over their history as well. It says, as strange beings with a developed magical ability. So they're feared them and they had a magical ability, exactly. All right. The historical Picts were bodies. Hold on. Historical Picts were remembered as being heavily tattooed, mainly blue in color. The elaborate patterns that adorned their bodies were similar to the spirals, circles, dots, and lines that cover the prehistoric stones and the canonical patterns of a ritualized geometry. In the opinion of the Scottish antiquarian Lewis Spence, the word peck is obtained from the ancient British word from some group of fairies. Pisky or Putch, and in his book Fairy Tradition in Britain, Ryder 1948, Spence quotes a learned dissertation on this word by a certain Canon McCullough. I would suggest pausing right now and see if you can find any of the books, okay? A Fairy Tradition in Britain, or something written by Spence right there, okay? Take a look and see what you guys can find. So because, like I said, these books are hard to find, or you might be lucky and be able to find some of them right now. Okay. The Picts of folk tradition were a folk akin to trolls or dwarves. In medieval writings, the name Picts was still used for the people who had encountered the Romans. And if you watch, what was it? King David? No, not King David. King Arthur. They're talking about like the woads. Okay. It says harassed the Romano-British and struggled against the Scots. The Scottish literary forms of the name were, I'm not going to read all those little names, corresponding to Anglo-Saxon and Old English pectus and pectus. Now, from the northern Burland to the north of Scotland, these names in folk tradition became that of a mysterious race, and some of the traditions about this race were borrowed from those told by the Norsemen about their Duergar or dwarves. This folk tradition associated the Pects with megalithic remains and large buildings, and with legends of the origins of these. If these colloquial names were really those of the Picts of history, that people had undergone a strange transformation in tradition. They had become a mysterious folk, half goblin, half human. So it's like they're making up all of these different types of people in order to hide who was already here. They're trying to make up all these different people, dwarves, elves, goblins, in order to hide the identity of who was already on the lands of Britain, okay, and Ireland. It says, these semantic and folklore origins show how time never alters a tradition, even an oral tradition, without leaving grains of truth at the center. So even though they're trying to hide our information, hide who we are, there's still grains of truth. Just like when the other video on YouTube about the same thing right here, when it talks about them being, not like real men and having magical powers. Our people were the ones that were looked at as larger than life. Our people were the ones that were looked at as having magical powers. So as I said, still leaving grains of truth at the center. The conclusion can be drawn that the Picts or Pixies were a race of small, stocky beings who had a civilization of some complexity in Scotland thousands of years before Christ. Yes, many, many thousands of years before Caesarea. Depends on, what son of the Most High you're talking about. The one that they made up way after, or the one that came and visited his people. It says they were linked to a similarly diminutive people who dwelt in the southwestern parts of Britain, now called Devon, Cornwall, and Somerset. It must be emphasized that the original Pects were pre-Iberian. That is, they existed before 6000 BC. And see, we got the Gentiles trying to break down who these people were. After they'd taken our records and anglicized them and wrote themselves in there. Another important group of Scottish supernatural beings are remembered as the spirits of the air and sky. They are termed the slog, which translated means the airy multitude or host. There is an existing memory among the Western Outer Hebrides that they frequently clashed in the air during great battles, which shook the rocks of the earth and stained it red with blood. So like they're flying, right? The Slua are attributed with many Atlantean characteristics, such as the ability to levitate and fly, the use of powerful weapons of fire, and the forging of magical armor. Finally, the most significantly, the locations of their homeland or point of origin is given as the islands of the West. From these still living traditions emerge a strong indication that the Sloa myths stretch back in unbroken line to the days of the devastated post-Atlantean world and the powerful remnants of the aerial gods who survived the final wreckage. An archetypical tale associated with the fairy slogs is repeated again and again in the Scottish annals, and it is rendered most beautifully by Lewis Spence in his book Fairy Traditions in Britain. So that's the book you want to try to see if you guys can try to get. Lewis Spence in his book Fairy Traditions in Britain. Okay? In this work, it is portrayed as a legend gathered in this instance from the islands of Ben Bukula. We're going to stop right there. You guys can read the rest. But see, I gave a little bit of information. I said, talking about the fairies and who they actually represented. But you can see there's a whole lot of tie-ins with Atlanteans. There's a whole lot of tie-ins with, it seems like a lot of these movies that they've made about people flying and doing all these dragons and having all these magical powers and things like that, they were getting from our information. So now when you look at a lot of this, you're looking at a lot of these movies, you start to see that, yes, this stuff is true. But it was associated with the people that came before the Indo-Europeans. Even though they try to write themselves in there, we know that that this information and this history is ours, family. And there's a lot more to come. So this is just like a little taste. So now when you start to think back, you start to look at the other books like Jasher. You start to look at the things that our people were able to do. These were the actions that our people were able to perform back then when we had the strength and our power was with us. That's why it's so important, like remember how Achior was talking about in Judith. If they're with their people, if these Hebrews are with their God, there's nothing you're going to be able to do to them. But if they're not with their power, then you can get at them. The Most High is bringing this knowledge and understanding back to our people, bringing the information and the knowledge of what we used to be and what we used to be able to do and what we will be able to do again. These are very exciting times. Let's all pray for one another. All praise is to the Most High, Yahweh. Acknowledgement to the earthly mother, who was wisdom, who was Holy Spirit. Acknowledge Hawashai. Shalom.